Something is happening right now, something that most Americans have not fully been told. And once you understand the full picture, you will never look at this conflict the same way again. We are living through a moment that history books will spend chapters on, and yet the average American sitting at home, paying $4 more for a gallon of gas, worrying about heating bills and grocery prices, has no idea that what is driving all of that pain, all of that financial pressure, traces directly back to a strategic decision made in Beijing, not Washington, not Tel Aviv, Beijing. And the most unnerving part is that China has been playing this game so quietly, so methodically, so carefully, that even the most informed observers are only now starting to see the full shape of what Beijing is doing. This is not speculation. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented, confirmed, and in some cases admitted to by the United States government itself. The question is not whether China is involved. The question is, what does China actually want, and what does it mean for the United States, for your family, for the world order we have all grown up assuming would last forever? On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a series of coordinated strikes against Iran in what became known as Operation Epic Fury, a conflict that has fundamentally upended the dynamics of the Middle East. The opening salvo was designed to decapitate the Iranian regime. It took out Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and triggered a torrent of hundreds of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones from Iran across the region. What followed was chaos, regional chaos, global economic chaos, and a humanitarian catastrophe that is still unfolding today. But buried inside all of that chaos, operating in the shadows, is China. And China's role in all of this is far more complex, far more calculated, and far more consequential than anything you have likely heard discussed in a 30-second news segment. Let's start with what China actually did and didn't do in the immediate hours after the war began. 2 days into the war, during a regular news conference at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, business continued as normal, as if the United States and Israel had not just attacked one of China's comprehensive strategic partners. When it became clear that China would remain silent, an Iranian journalist protested. Only then did the ministry spokesperson reluctantly condemn the assault. Think about that for a moment. Think about what that silence communicates. Iran is one of China's most significant strategic partners. China has a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Iran. There are potentially $400 billion in Chinese investment commitments tied to Iranian oil, gas, and infrastructure. And yet, silence. 2 days of silence. That is not an accident. That is a calculation. And understanding that calculation is the key to understanding everything that comes next. In the days that followed, China became a vocal critic of the attacks. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi argued, "Might does not make right," warning that the attacks proved that the world has regressed to the law of the jungle. Yet for all his strong words, Wang stopped short of explicitly naming the United States or Israel as the aggressor. Strong words, careful words, words that were designed to be heard in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Moscow, in Brussels, but not words that would trigger any formal consequences from Washington. China was threading a needle so fine that most of the world didn't even notice what was happening. They were performing neutrality while practicing something entirely different underneath the surface. And here is where it gets deeply serious and deeply important for every American watching. Because what China has been doing in this conflict is not nothing. It is not performative diplomacy. A burgeoning body of evidence indicates that China has significantly contributed intelligence support, satellite navigation, radar systems, and electronic warfare technologies that augment Iran's targeting capabilities. Let that land. China's technology, China's systems have been woven into Iran's ability to fire missiles with precision, to hit targets, to locate American assets, to make this war harder, costlier, and more dangerous for the United States and its forces in the region. China has spent years reshaping Iran's electronic warfare landscape, exporting advanced radar systems, transitioning Iranian military navigation from American GPS to China's encrypted Beidou 3 constellation, and drawing on its expanding satellite network to support signals intelligence and terrain mapping for Iranian forces. The Beidou 3 system, China's answer to GPS, is now guiding Iranian missiles. That is not a metaphor. That is a technical reality. The YLC-8B anti-stealth radar, a Chinese-supplied system, uses low-frequency waves designed to reduce the effectiveness of radar-absorbent coatings on American stealth aircraft. The B-21 Raider and the F-35C were engineered to be invisible, and China's technology is making them more visible to Iranian air defenses. Now, China will tell you, and has told you, through its embassy spokesperson, that China has never provided weapons to any party to the conflict. The information in question is untrue. And officially, China has maintained that position throughout the war. But the intelligence picture painted by United States officials and independent analysts tells a far more complicated story. China facilitates the transfer of both Chinese and Western-made navigation technology to Iran. Chinese electronics markets and distributors play a critical role in this process. Some experts believe that Iranian drones and missiles incorporate Chinese satellite navigation systems to target United States and Israeli military assets. And then came the bombshell that arrived just days ago. On April 11, 2026, several days after the initiation of a 2-week ceasefire, CNN reported that, according to United States intelligence sources, China was preparing to ship man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS, to Iran through third countries. MANPADS, portable, shoulder-fired missiles capable of bringing down aircraft. The Chinese Foreign Ministry denied it. But here is what President Trump himself said. Trump warned that China would face a 50% tariff if it transfers weapons to Iran, but said he doubted Beijing would do so, despite United States intelligence indicating it had such plans. The President of the United States was publicly warning China not to do something that his own intelligence community was telling him China was actively preparing to do. That is an extraordinary moment. That is the kind of moment that does not get enough sustained attention in our news cycle, and it absolutely should. One source familiar with the intelligence said China sees no real strategic value in overtly entering the conflict and trying to protect Iran against the United States and Israel, which they know would be unwinnable. Instead, Beijing is trying to position itself as a continued friend to Iran, whose oil it heavily depends upon, while remaining outwardly neutral so they can maintain deniability after the war is over. Read that again. Beijing wants to help Iran survive this war without being seen helping Iran survive this war. That is the strategy. Maintain deniability. Keep the oil flowing. Position yourself as the peacemaker. And then, when the shooting stops, be the country that everyone turns to for reconstruction, for stabilization, for investment. China wants to emerge from this war as the responsible adult in the room, while having quietly tilted the playing field the entire time. 45% of China's 11 million barrels per day of oil comes from the Gulf. Planners and risk managers in Beijing have to be deeply concerned about the direction of travel, with Washington using energy as leverage in these conflicts. This is the core driver of everything China is doing, energy security. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile-wide choke point between Oman and Iran, is the jugular vein of China's economic body. Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz disrupted 20% of global oil supplies and significant liquefied natural gas volumes. Exports from the region typically go to Asian countries, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea accounting for 75% of oil and 59% of LNG exports from the Gulf region. When the strait closes, China bleeds. And so China has enormous incentive, not just ideological, not just political, but raw economic incentive, to see this conflict end in a way that preserves Iranian power, or at least Iranian cooperation, over that waterway. The head of the International Energy Agency described the situation caused by the war as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. And yet somehow, in the American media conversation, we spend more time arguing about the politics of the war than about the structural economic consequences that are now reshaping the global order in real time. Brent crude, the international benchmark, closed at just over $95 a barrel recently, having gained over 31% since the war in Iran began at the end of February. That is not an abstract statistic. That is what Americans are feeling at the pump. That is what is putting pressure on supply chains, on food prices, on airline tickets, on everything. And China's strategic calculus, China's relationship with Iran, China's role in prolonging this conflict is embedded in all of it. Chinese banks, Front companies and intermediary firms facilitate oil transactions, the shadow fleet that transports Iranian oil, access to controlled technologies that support Iran's missile and drone programs, and money laundering that enables it all. The United States has known about this for years. The sanctions have not stopped it. The warnings have not stopped it. The reason they have not stopped it is because China's economic relationship with Iran is so deeply structural, so baked into the way both economies function, that it cannot be severed by a tariff threat or a strongly worded statement from the State Department. Iran's oil trade with China is significant, with China being the primary buyer of Iranian oil, importing over 80% of Iran's oil exports through unofficial channels that circumvent sanctions. 80%. China is essentially Iran's economic lifeline. And as long as China keeps buying Iranian oil, Iran has the economic oxygen it needs to keep fighting, to keep resisting, to keep the pressure on. Now, here is where we have to talk about what China said it was doing, because this is where the story gets genuinely strange and genuinely important. Even as all of this was unfolding, even as intelligence agencies were tracking Chinese origin components flowing into Iranian weapons systems, China was also presenting itself to the world as a peacemaker. Since the conflict began, China held an objective, just, and balanced position and was working to help bring about a ceasefire. Foreign Minister Wang Yi made 26 phone calls with parties including Iran, Israel, Russia, and the Gulf states. The special envoy of the Chinese government on the Middle East traveled to the region in a mediation effort. 26 phone calls, a special envoy dispatched to the region, a 5-point peace initiative co-authored with Pakistan. China was performing simultaneously the role of arms enabler and peace broker. And the remarkable thing is, it almost worked. Both roles simultaneously in the same geopolitical theater. Trump told the AFP news agency that he believed China played a role in pushing Iran to negotiate the 2-week ceasefire. "I hear yes," he said when asked whether Beijing was involved in bringing its ally Tehran to the table. The President of the United States, the same president whose intelligence community was warning him that China was preparing to ship weapons to Iran, that was also crediting China with helping produce the ceasefire. That is the shape of modern great power competition. It is not clean. It is not binary. It is not good guys and bad guys in the way that a lot of our political conversation would have us believe. It is a world where China can simultaneously enable a war and mediate a ceasefire and extract leverage from both actions. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif credited China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar with extending invaluable support in the effort to achieve a temporary ceasefire between the United States and Iran, with Israel also agreeing to cease strikes against the Islamic Republic. China got credit for the peace, and China also benefited from the war. The oil price spike enriched state-owned energy companies that had stockpiled Iranian crude at discounted rates before the conflict erupted. The disruption to global supply chains accelerated negotiations in various parts of the world, where China is offering its own alternative infrastructure, its own trade routes, its own version of the global economic order that bypasses American-dominated institutions. Chinese firms with links to the People's Liberation Army, such as Mizar Vision and Jing'an Technology, have marketed geospatial intelligence on United States forces in the region. Multiple sanctioned Iranian ships believed to be carrying sodium perchlorate, a precursor material for solid propellant rockets, have traveled from China to Iran since the war began. Solid propellant rocket fuel, geospatial intelligence on American troop positions. These are not the actions of a neutral country. These are the actions of a country that has made a strategic determination about where its interests lie and has acted on that determination while maintaining just enough deniability to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States. For China, the world's foremost energy importer, sustaining stable relations with Tehran is crucial for guaranteeing long-term oil supplies and ensuring uninterrupted maritime trade routes. Iran functions as a pivotal hub in China's Belt and Road Initiative, offering terrestrial and maritime pathways connecting East Asia to Europe and the Mediterranean, while also regulating access to the Strait of Hormuz. The Belt and Road Initiative, that massive multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure project that China has been building across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and beyond, runs through Iran. Iran is not a peripheral concern for Beijing. Iran is a central node in China's vision for a new global economic architecture, a vision that, by definition, reduces American influence over global trade, global finance, and global security arrangements. Future wars may not necessarily involve direct military confrontation between great powers. Instead, they may unfold through indirect competition, proxy conflicts, and technological support to regional actors. Understanding the evolving intelligence and technological cooperation between China and Iran is therefore essential for analyzing the changing balance of power in the Middle East and the wider trajectory of global strategic competition in the 21st century. This is the new reality that every American who cares about where this country is headed needs to sit with. We are not just watching a regional war in the Middle East. We are watching the opening moves of a new global order being contested, not on a traditional battlefield, but through satellite constellations, supply chain manipulation, intelligence sharing, economic partnerships, and the careful, patient, strategic positioning of a country that has decided it wants to lead the world and is willing to do what it takes, quietly, methodically, with maximum deniability, to get there. The ceasefire is fragile. Netanyahu said clearly, "This is not the end of the campaign. We still have some goals to accomplish, and we will achieve these goals either from agreement and consensus or from renewal of the war, because we are ready to do so whenever necessary. Our finger is on the trigger." The American military has echoed that posture. The top United States general told a press conference, "Let us be clear, a ceasefire is a pause, and the joint force remains ready if ordered or called upon." So the guns are paused, but they are not lowered. The talks in Islamabad have already broken down once. And in the background of all of this, China is watching, calculating, positioning, and deciding how much more it can do for Iran, how much more pressure it can apply on the United States, and how it can emerge from whatever comes next as the indispensable power that everyone needs and nobody can afford to alienate. Former United States Ambassador Nikki Haley said Trump needs to confront China much more aggressively than he has over its support for Iran. She is not alone in that view. There is a growing argument inside foreign policy circles that the American response to Chinese behavior in this conflict has been insufficient, that the warnings have not been backed up with consequences, that the tariff threats have not changed Chinese calculations, and that Beijing has correctly assessed that Washington is too stretched, too distracted, and too dependent on the global economic relationship with China to actually impose the kind of costs that would force a change in Beijing's behavior. And that is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of all of this. The United States is in a conflict with Iran, but the conflict that may define the next 50 years, the contest that will shape what kind of world your children and grandchildren inherit, is the one playing out right now, quietly and without front lines, between Washington and Beijing. China has exposed its strategy in this war. It has shown what it values, what it is willing to risk, what kind of power it wants to be. The question, the urgent, pressing, urgent question for American policymakers, for American citizens, for every person watching this, is whether the United States has a strategy that is equal to the moment. Because Beijing does, and Beijing is already playing the next move.